Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Before I introduce our presenters, I just want to cover a few housekeeping notes. First, we just ask that you keep yourself muted throughout today's session. There might be a time during the discussion session where we invite you to unmute yourselves, but during the presentations, just stay on mute. All questions are going to be addressed at the end of the presentation, but we encourage you to submit them in the chat at any time. And for today's session, we will be recording, and this will be made available at a later date if you want to revisit or share the presentation. Today's presenters are Dr. Taha, Saleem, and Libby Thomas of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, and I'm going to pass it over to Taha to get us started off.
Thank you, Kelly. Can you hear me properly? Is all good?
Yes.
Beautiful, guys, and you can see my slideshow.
Yes.
Perfect, guys. So good morning, everyone. My name is Taha Saleem, and I work for the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. And today I will be giving you a brief overview of the tool called CMF Clearinghouse. CMF Clearinghouse is a tool that is used by researchers and practitioners around the country to help in making important safety decisions. Now, one second. There we go. So yeah, so before we talk about the CMF Clearinghouse tool itself, let's discuss some basics about what a CMF or a crash modification is and what it means. So a brief definition of a CMF, is that a CMF is a multiplicative factor that reflects the safety effect of a countermeasure and is used to compute the expected number of crashes after implementing a given countermeasure at a specific site. So here in this definition, a countermeasure or countermeasures are strategies intended to reduce crashes on the road. And examples of such strategies could include the addition of signs, signals, markings, or even changes in roadway designs. Now, if you look at in the past literature, you will also notice that at some places CMFs are also referred to as AMFs, or accident modification factors. They are basically the same thing. CMF is you can say a more modern terminology. In the past, they were commonly referred to as accident modification factors or AMFs, but they're both the same thing. So let's move on and let's talk about how to interpret CMFs. So the scale for interpreting the increases or decreases in crashes revolves around 1. So here, we can see in the small table that I've posted that is on my slide at the top here, that a CMF of 1 pretty much indicates no changes in crashes. A CMF of less than 1 would indicate a decrease in the number of crashes, and a CMF that's more than 1 would indicate an increase in the number of crashes. Now, just to give a few examples here, of some CMF numbers. So in this case, you can see a CMF of 0 would technically represent 100% decrease in the number of crashes. Similarly, a CMF of 0.8 would represent a 20% decrease in the number of crashes. So we take 1 as our baseline, and then we go percentage points, take percentage points out from 1. So 0.8 means 20% decrease in the number of crashes. Similarly, 1.2, CMF 1.2 would mean a 20% increase in number of crashes, or a CMF of 2.2 would represent a 120% increase in crashes. Now, one thing to note here is that since a CMF of 0 represents 100% reduction in crashes, CMFs can never be less than 0. So it always be 0 or more than 0. So they can never be below 0. So now talking about various ways in which researchers and practitioners use CMFs. So the first of the various ways that researchers and practitioners can use CMFs are to identifying the most cost-effective strategies when considering various different countermeasures. And this is done in a way because CMFs can indicate which countermeasure will have the greatest impact on decreasing crashes. The second way researchers and practitioners can use CMFs is in identifying the most cost-effective locations for using safety funding. And CMFs can assist in this by practitioners in this by helping them determine where to deploy countermeasures in order to yield the most crash savings. The third way CMFs can be used by practitioners and researchers is to compare the results of their new analyses to existing CMFs. And in this domain, CMFs can assist researchers, by giving them a context to newly produced CMFs to check for the validity of their results. And also the last way, we can have the fourth point here, in which the researchers and practitioners can use CMFs are in checking the validity of the assumptions in cost-benefit analysis, because CMFs can provide a basis for conducting cost-benefit analysis, which can be used to determine if a proposed project is worth undertaking. So this was a brief overview of what CMFs are and what and how to interpret them. Now let's move on to discussing about CMF Clearinghouse and what CMF Clearinghouse is. So CMF Clearinghouse is, you can say, a comprehensive and searchable database that's available to transportation professionals. And in this database, we have a repository of all the published CMFs, as well as additional information and resources related to CMFs. So CMF Clearinghouse database is funded by the US Department of Transportation's Federal Highway Administration, and is maintained by the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. And the good thing is that the CMF Clearinghouse database is available publicly, free of charge, and you all can access it at www.cmfclearinghouse.org. Moving forward, the CMF Clearinghouse has various purposes. So amongst the various purposes, the first one is providing CMF data, which is done by providing a comprehensive and searchable database of published CMFs to researchers and practitioners. The second purpose of the CMF Clearinghouse is to educate CMF users, and that is done by providing guidance materials to instruct users about the appropriate use of CMFs. And the third purpose of the CMF Clearinghouse is facilitating CMF research, which is done by allowing for identification of research gaps to direct future research. So when we talk about the features of CMF Clearinghouse, the CMF Clearinghouse pretty much allows users to use the search feature on the homepage, where users can search for CMFs by keywords. And we also have a list of the most frequently searched terms that users can click to have a feel of how what different CMFs are attached to the different treatments. And there's also a browse all CMF function where you can click the browse all function, and that would pretty much give you a whole list of CMFs in the clearinghouse that you can eventually export to Excel for easy viewing as well. Also, the CMF Clearinghouse users can also learn more about applying CMFs by going into the various sections of the website, which are about clearinghouse section. We have a using CMF section, and we have a developing CMF section. All of these sections in the website, they provide more information to users about how to apply CMFs. Users can also get resources on CMF related trainings and publications in the additional resources section of the website. And last but not the least, they can also submit their own CMF studies to be included in the CMF Clearinghouse. Next one. Perfect. So the one good thing here, guys, is that all the CMFs that are included in the CMF Clearinghouse are assigned a star quality rating. And we use a star quality rating to indicate the quality or confidence in the results of the study that has produced a CMF. So star quality ratings, they are based on a set of criteria, which includes study design, sample size, standard error, potential bias, and data source. So a star rating is based on a scale of 1 to 5, where a 5-star indicates the highest or best rating, and a 1 indicates the lowest or the worst rating. So now that we have talked about the CMF Clearinghouse in general, the purpose of the clearinghouse, its uses, and also the quality ratings, let's over the next few slides, we can talk about how to search for CMFs in the CMF Clearinghouse. I will present you with some examples and how to address some common issues that may arise in your searches. So when you're searching for CMFs, you can see the screenshot at the bottom, which is a screenshot from the home page of the clearinghouse. You can search the search function, which is the text box that says enter search terms, and you can search by different keywords, that you want to search for. You can also use the most frequent searches that are displayed below the search bar. In this screenshot, you can see that we have 5 frequent searches that are known as roundabouts, signals, pedestrian, shoulders, and TISVO, along with the browse all button. So if you don't know what you're searching for, you can always click that browse all button, and you have a mega list of CMFs, where you can go ahead and filter out, the list according to your own needs, and come down to CMFs that you would like to see or use. So when you're searching for CMF, say when you search for a keyword, here, the first issue, that might arise, is dealing with too many search results. So here, I have example, In the first screenshot at the top here, where if you search for edge line, say for example, as a keyword, it would return you about 420 CMFs. Now you can either look at the 420 CMFs and just 1 second. Perfect. So you can either look at the 420 CMFs and you can filter down your list, or you can narrow down your search using some more keywords. So searching for the keyword edge line returns about 420 CMFs. But if I search for edge line width, for example, I can increase my keywords there. I can narrow down my search to about 54 CMFs, which is, we can say, more reasonable and more easier for you to go over and figure out which CMFs apply or pertain to your specific conditions. And option two, if you're dealing with too many search results, the second option you have is to narrow it down using search filters. So in this first example, where we search for edge line and we have 420 CMFs, that were returned. If you go to the search results page, you can see that we have filters provided on the left side of the search screen. So in this next page, and I just show you some examples. So if you filter those 420 CMFs by the star quality rating, and you say you want to filter for the higher star rating, which would be 4 or 5 star CMFs, you can get 116 CMFs, down from 420 CMFs. You can also filter by the crash type. So in this case, I have an example where I filter for runoff road crashes only, and I can bring down my total number of search results from 420 to 235 if I specify a specific crash type. Looking at crash severity, I can also filter down by crash severity. So if I am only looking for CMFs that pertain to fatal or severe injury crashes, for example, I can filter for fatal and severe injury, and my search results would be narrowed down to 373 CMFs from 420 CMFs. So these are just a few ways, where you can either narrow down your search results by using more keywords, or you can also narrow down your search results by using the filters on the search results page. One more issue that comes up, when you're searching for CMFs, and you will notice, if you have used Clearinghouse or plan to use it, is that you might see that there are multiple CMFs for the same crash type and severity, sometimes even from same studies. So in this specific example, if you search for the countermeasures that says provide a left turn lane on one major road approach, you can see that the study by Harwood in 2002, it produced 2 CMFs for all crashes and all crash severities. So for total crashes, all severities, there are 2 CMFs. One is 0.73, one is 0.76. Now, when you look at it, it's from the same study, same crash type, same crash severity, but there are 2 CMFs. You can wonder what the difference and what you should use. So if ever you come in the situation where there are multiple CMFs for the same crash type and severity, the best way would be to check that box right beside those CMFs and hit the compare button on the top. So there's a compare tool which will detail the information about both CMFs for you, and there you can see what are the major differences between the 2 CMFs. So if I check the boxes and hit the compare tool, I can have this. It will open a new window where I'll have results here, and anything highlighted in blue are the differences. So I can see that even though both the CMFs look at total crashes and all severities, the CMF of 0.73, which is the first one, looks at only stop control intersections, whereas the CMF of 0.76, which is the second one, looks at signalized intersections. So that will give us more clarity to identify CMFs for our specific use cases. Whether we want to use a CMF for stop control or signalized, we can use the appropriate CMF here. Another example, here, of similar ways, when you use there's a countermeasure that I searched for, which is converting high occupancy vehicles HOV lanes to high occupancy toll lanes, HOT lanes. So in this case, if you look at it, there were 2 CMFs in the same study for total crashes, looking at fatal and injury total crashes, you can say, severity, and there were 0.96 and 0.72. So when we look at it, we can see that the major difference between these 2 CMFs is that the CMF of 0.96 applies to the whole roadway section, whereas the CMF of 0.72 only applies to high occupancy toll lanes only. So this compare tool is a very useful tool, guys. If you see that you're coming up with that your search results are coming up with the same with multiple CMFs or the same crash types or severities, you can always use this compare tool and try to see what are the differences in those CMFs, and what conditions they apply to in deciding whether a specific CMF will be good for your particular use case or not. So these were the few examples, that I had for, searching the CMFs and the issues that come up, when you search for CMFs and how to resolve them. Of course, now the last thing you might answer, what can you use the CMF clearinghouse for as a practitioner? So there are various things, you can do at the CMF clearinghouse. Once you go to the website, cmfclearinghouse.org, you can learn more about what CMFs are, what they're applied for. You can also learn more about how to identify potential countermeasures, how to obtain the expected effectiveness of the various countermeasures. And of course, you can compare alternative treatments if you're looking at different treatments and trying to find the safety effectiveness of the various different treatments. You can also get information on trainings that are linked to CMFs. On that note, we have an annual webinar for the CMF clearinghouse that we have every year around mid-December, and it's going to be happening in this year, December too. And the announcement for that webinar will be posted on the website hopefully towards the end of this month. So for those of you who are interested in coming to the webinar and seeing how CMFs are applied in real world situations, you're free to join the webinar and get some more information on how various states and practitioners are using CMFs in their research and in their decision making process. And last but not the least, you can also find resources on the website on how to use CMFs in your cost benefit analysis. So yeah, so that was a brief overview of the clearinghouse and a few examples of how to use the clearinghouse. I can answer any more questions. I think we are keeping the questions for the end after Libby's presentation. So I can answer any questions that come up in the chat box at that time. And also, if you have any further questions that you would want to discuss with me, you're free to contact me. I have my contact information on this slide. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation this morning. And I think Kelly, we can move to Libby now. Kelly, are you there? Libby, are you there, Libby?
Yes, I am, and I'm
perfect. And I see your screen now. Yeah,
you can see it. Okay.
But Libby, you have to move the presenter view on the screen.
Well, okay. Let me see. Share. I think I haven't started this show yet, so just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how are we doing? Are you seeing the slideshow or the?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay.
I can see your slideshow, Libby.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Taha. That was a great overview of the CMF clearinghouse, showing just how complex it is to identify the right types of treatments for the location and the problem types that people have. So this presentation is building from that type of safety practice and is based on some research we did for the NCHRP program, which most of you are aware of. And I'll just move on into the presentation now. So many of you know, and I apologize, I did not update the data for 2018, but pedestrian fatalities have been increasing since 2009 and before in the US. Meanwhile, other types of crashes and fatalities have been going down. This has been a concern to practitioners and suggests to us that what we've been doing is not really sufficient. So there's some pretty big road safety challenges. Identifying the right locations for treatment can be really difficult, and prioritizing costly treatments to address locations that may seem to be high crash, that results in our ability to treat only relatively few locations. We know that we're really missing many locations that may be expected to have crashes in the future. A lot of road safety has been based in the past on nominal safety, to borrow from some of the work Wes and others have done with the Road Safety Academy that HSRC leads. And that means the safety that we apply is based on a lot of standards and guidelines, but it isn't really addressing the human needs and conditions of using a road network. So Vision Zero approaches have been suggested to treat the whole system, including places that may be expected to have crashes in the future. So we want to identify some new methods to maybe be more proactive in our thinking, and also identify patterns and issues that we perhaps should consider as we design networks and make larger changes to our network, so we can avoid building these same kinds of problems into our systems in the future. For example, so just to illustrate here, the systemic approach is kind of midway. It's a complementary approach to the typical safety approaches, which are more reactive. You identify a crash hotspot and treat it. And practitioners are finding that they are just kind of chasing these hotspots. They can never catch up, and it's really not a completely effective approach. So next way down, you may take a corridor type of approach, this, the second box down on the right in the image, and that allows you to say, well, this whole corridor has similar conditions. Let's not only put that treatment in at the one intersection, but let's treat these other intersections similarly. A systemic approach kind of takes that idea and looks for places across the network that may have similar risks and conditions, and aims to identify the right types of treatments to address those concerns. And then finally, at the bottom is a more systematic or policy-based approach, where you would say anywhere we have land uses that invite pedestrians or bicyclists to walk, or we have certain parameters such as traffic signals, we should give pedestrian signal heads and leading pedestrian intervals to try to improve safety at these locations. So those are the kind of things that might be considered in a sort of policy or systematic approach to treat the whole network. But that's very costly. And so in a systemic approach, we've tried to identify some procedures that can allow a cost-effective prioritization of treatments to be more proactive than we have been in the past. So the tenets of a systemic approach then are to take the data on the system and identify safety concerns based on evaluation of data at the whole system or network level. And this includes crash data, roadway data, and built environment data such as land uses, and even population characteristics we found can help us to do a better job of this. And then by analyzing these data, we can identify some of those common risk patterns and prioritize locations that may benefit from this kind of treatment package. Now, it's most effective if we can identify effective but lower cost safety countermeasures so that they can be applied to more locations. And the other thing we want to do with this kind of approach is emphasize more severe crashes. What types of crashes are we seeing that tend to lead to more severe injuries? And we'll talk a little bit more about that further. So then we can prioritize these locations where these treatable risk factors are present, regardless of whether they have a prior crash history. And we know crashes, especially more rare pedestrian, bicycle crashes, and more severe injury crashes tend to occur sporadically across the network. And these have been thought to be somewhat random, and they do move around. And that is part of the challenge in using a traditional approach to prioritize locations to treat. So this approach can help us overcome some of those problems. And this process builds on some earlier work for the Federal Highway Administration. Joe Toole, who was one of our research partners in the NCHRP project, kind of, I think, generated this idea initially that maybe we don't have to wait till crashes occur if we can identify these common patterns and risks that can be widely treated with effective countermeasures. It also builds on the Highway Safety Manual, which I wanted to mention was the first edition of the Highway Safety Manual, only came out in 2010, that really focused on approaches to safety, whereas the Highway Capacity Manual, the first edition, came out in 1950. So that also suggests some of the issues we're facing in addressing safety in our society with these pressures to keep mobility high. We also look for other systemic and risk-based analyses that states and localities had applied. One of those was with the Arizona DOT, and Charlie Seguir, one of our longtime staff members, was involved in that study. But in general, these examples, especially using pedestrian data, were kind of limited and not always systemic. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. As I mentioned, pedestrian crashes may be rare, and so using a frequency-based approach where crashes have already occurred is generally fairly unreliable and cost ineffective, because we may treat a place that experienced a fatality or a serious injury or two during one cycle, and then in the next few years, a different location experiences a fatality or serious injuries. In addition, the risk factors for pedestrians are very different, and the kind of exposure situation for pedestrians is very different than for motor vehicle only crashes. And the process needs to be tailored to recognize this. An example is probably the best way of explaining this. So conceive of a multi-lane divided corridor that looks like a highway that probably provides a high level of safety for motor vehicles. It separates the opposing directions of traffic. It may have ramps to take traffic onto and off that highway, which minimizes the chances of an angle type collision. And speeds may therefore be high. Mobility may be high on that corridor for cars. But then that corridor also has multifamily housing along it and is served by transit. So then we have people, maybe transit ends at night, just when people are returning home from work in their service jobs, and they're forced to walk long distances. Maybe their transit stop, isn't being served when they get off work. So they're walking along this corridor, which may be poorly lit, and then they're also forced to try to detect a safe time and location to cross this highway in the dark. So we know it's difficult for pedestrians to perceive the speed and closing distance of vehicles at night. They don't have those landmarks so that they can judge. And it's also, of course, difficult for drivers to see pedestrians. So this kind of sets up a situation where there's a high risk of something happening at some point in time. And it may be rare that these crashes occur, but this is what we're trying to help understand through this kind of work and do a better job of preventing these kinds of scenarios. So our research and paper proposes that some new types of data, along with some types that have been encouraged for years but are still not widely collected, be considered, and that new ways of looking at the network and land use and pedestrianism are really needed for comprehending pedestrian safety. And one of those new types of data are counting pedestrians. Motor vehicles traffic has been counted for ages, but pedestrians have not been counted. That this is changing somewhat, and more agencies are understanding the need for this. which can help us estimate the kinds of places where people are walking or need to walk. But at the same time, the safety process should be reliable and helpful to identify locations that might benefit from treatment. So that's why we identified the steps and the approaches that we did. And it does build on all those resources I mentioned earlier. So this is the 7-step process, which is basically identify the jurisdictions and the types of crashes that you're going to focus on. What is the extent or scope of the network that you're going to consider? Compile the data, and this may require collecting data from unusual sources, as I mentioned, such as the census and land use data and other types that maybe safety analysts haven't been using, along with roadway data and crash data. And then you use all those data to analyze and determine risk factors. And the next step, step 4, you identify potential treatments and treatment sites, and then you select the potential countermeasures that can address the risks at those locations. And then in step 6, you refine and implement your treatment plan, and step 7, you evaluate the plan. Now, this is very similar to the regular safety process, but here we put these steps in a circle because they're really somewhat iterative. Because back here in step 1, when we're trying to define the study scope, we're also thinking, what are the potential treatments that we know can help address the patterns that we're seeing? So you think about step 5 as well. And when you're compiling your data, you do that. When we're determining risk factors, we're also thinking, what can we do about that risk? Do we have effective treatments that can help us reduce that risk? So it's sort of an iterative approach. And the other thing that it does is not think about one site at a time, but to really, if we have good data, then we can start kind of diagnosing what the issues are, and using our context data, we can further refine the types of treatments that might help reduce those risks. So it uses the data more effectively to get further along in the process before engineers and others have to go out into the field or do more site-specific diagnosis. And then sites can be bundled together to do these kinds of cost-benefit analysis using the kinds of data that Taha was talking about, the cost, the CMFs, and then the cost of the treatments to estimate our cost-benefit. So that's the basic process, and this is just an example of the kinds of data that were compiled for this type of work. So the first column just shows that we count the number of crashes that occur at each type of site, and this may be intersection focused or segment focused or focused on a length of roadway, a corridor that has similar characteristics. We use our automobile traffic, that's the MVAADT, as well as our PED count data or estimates. We may estimate average annual daily pedestrian volumes as well. We may have data that reflect what is the population of people living in this area. Are there a number of seniors who are using transit, and you know, they may be at more risk of severe injuries. We know certain kinds of land uses, such as universities, schools, and others, relate to how many people may be using in an area, but they may also relate to population characteristics and behaviors that can help us better understand risk. And then the roadway features, we want to capture the descriptors as well as we have them. And we know, again, a lot of these kinds of data, especially pedestrian-oriented facilities, are not yet widely collected and compiled with roadway inventories. And so that makes it a little bit difficult, but we do our best. So then ideally, we want to take what we found and do kind of a reality check by investigating sites that are predicted to have high risk and just see, yes, does this make sense? Can we see that this area is risky? Do the risk factors that jumped out, are they present, and do they seem to warrant treatment? So this is just walk through quickly an example. We conducted this kind of analysis using some data we had for the city of Seattle, which is leading in many areas, but one of those is trying to develop exposure or use count data to estimate volumes for all modes. So we had those kinds of data, and we had many, many variables about the roadway, the land use, and the populations that helped us understand the built and social environment of where people are walking and being hit. And again, we wanted to focus on some of the more severe crash types that were occurring. And through just a data and analysis of the crash data, we discovered that crashes involving motor vehicles going generally straight ahead and pedestrians crossing at non-intersection locations or along segments, that type was both high frequency, and it also tended to lead to more severe injury outcomes compared to all crash types. Similarly, excuse me, I have to pedestrian crashes that occurred at night, we know lead to more severe injuries oftentimes. And we know that nationally as well, where about 75 to 80% of pedestrian fatalities are happening at night. So we analyzed these types of crashes, pedestrian crashes at night between vehicles and pedestrians crossing at segments. And these are places that don't have traffic control or signals. A few had crossings, but many didn't. So again, that is a severe crash type. And we also know by the descriptors of those two types what some of the treatments might be. So that's the other thing that helps us in this process, is we kind of diagnose what's happening through the identification of the types that we use in our analysis when that is possible. Sometimes the crash data just aren't specified well enough to understand these kinds of events. The other thing, you see the other types of quantitative and categorical variables that I've already mentioned there at the bottom. So we compile all these types together and analyze them. And we use two steps because we have so many variables. We use an approach similar to data mining that is a regression analysis that helps us identify those variables that might be most useful to use in crash prediction. The conditional random forest regression, for those of you who are modelers, isn't, however, that great for statistical significance testing, but it does allow us to narrow down variables, those that don't have much ability at all or don't seem at all related to our outcome crashes. We can then not use those in our further regression modeling. So we took two steps, and these are just the generic results of the variables that prove to be important for both of these two types of crashes. And I'm just going to go through this quickly, but a lot of these are related to the volumes, where cars are and where people are walking, transit stops, and the amount of activity at transit stops. Then you also see some associations there with population characteristics. The mean income of area residents was further predictive of crashes even after we accounted for these volumes. So that suggests there's something unmeasured associated with lower income neighborhoods that is increasing crash risk. It may be that our estimates of pedestrian activity just aren't as precise as we would like, and there are more people walking than we captured in our models, or that there are other things going on that might be associated just with that neighborhood, older infrastructure, things that just aren't fully accounted for or fully measured. And then we also have a number of measures such as the commercial density was very highly associated with pedestrian crashes in both of these types of models. Unfortunately, sometimes you get this situation where a measure that seems to be a safety measure has an unexpected direction of effect. So here, the light pole density was positively correlated with our pedestrian crashes, even those at night. And so that suggests that we're not able to fully account for the implementation of this measure or its quality. And it may be that light poles are just associated with, were implemented where more crashes occurred or areas that were already high risk. And because we weren't fully able to account for the traffic and the conditions before that was done, then it has this unexpected positive relationship to crashes. So then what we're doing with the other results, these are roadway and built environment measures that were categorical. And what we're doing here is looking for those, the ones that are highlighted in bold, we're looking for those kinds of features of the roadway that we might be able to do something about. And so which ones are treatable with countermeasures? And so I've sort of highlighted those there in bold font. And you can see the relationships with higher speed roads. More lanes are predictive of those straight through kind of crashes at segments. Two-way left turn lanes were associated with both types. That's not a surprise to many of you. It has long been thought to be a dangerous situation. And we were able to confirm that in these analyses. And then parking was associated with the straight through crashes. You can imagine that parking maybe blocks visibility between drivers and pedestrians who might step out along a segment. And then also we found that when there were right turn lanes at either adjacent intersection, it was associated with more risk at those segments. And you can imagine that might be the case because pedestrians may have trouble crossing at such locations. Some of those may be free flow or motorists aren't stopping before turning right on red. And so rather than face that at the intersection, they may move up to the segment and try their chances at crossing. And then again, this is another situation where marked crosswalks were associated with more crashes. And again, this is probably because those are places that funnel pedestrians to cross, but they may also not be treated highly enough. They may need additional treatments to make them safer for the people who are crossing there. And then finally, one-way traffic flow appeared to have a protective effect for pedestrians crossing the road at night. And that could be because they only have one direction of traffic to deal with at a time, but also maybe headlight glare. It may be easier for motor vehicles to see those pedestrians crossing and such. So those are some of the factors we found in this particular study. And they're pretty consistent with prior research literature or with theoretical explanations as well. So you want to do a gut check on the relationship of those variables. And the other thing we did then is also think, okay, well, here are our features associated with the road that seem to be associated with increased risk. Are there things that we can do about that? And that's where Taha's CMF Clearinghouse comes into effect. So before this, we had already identified a number of treatments that we thought made sense to possibly apply on a systemic approach and address these kinds of risks. And those were identified in the research report. We don't have time to go into all those today. But then how do we apply all this information to help practitioners make good decisions? So there are a couple of things, a couple of ways you can go about it. If you have endless money, you can just identify all the segments that have those risk factors and say, we're going to treat all of them. But in reality, we know that's unlikely. And also, you don't want to treat locations that have a very low expectation of pedestrians walking there. So we use the predictions from the models to help us narrow down the places that really may be expected to have crashes in future. At least we can rank those locations, and then we can further use that information later on in the cost benefit type of analysis. So this kind of shows that procedure of, okay, here are the number of segments out of the top 500 for predicted crashes that had the 4 or more through lanes, one of our risk factors. And then narrowing that down, we also have 152 of those sites that also have two-way left turn lanes. So it may be even easier to treat those locations over on the right or some of the potential countermeasures. So at first we can maybe consider road diets for some of those 4-lane locations. We might be able to implement median islands at some of them, but if we have two-way left turn lanes, then we have a good idea that there's space to implement a median island regardless. And we know that median islands have been associated with reduced pedestrian crashes. And so that's the kind of filtering process based on features of the roadway that you can go through. And then finally at the bottom here where you have parking, then we could also further implement curb extensions and parking restrictions to help pedestrians be more visible to motor vehicles and for them to see each other and to reduce that crossing distance and getting across the road. So this is just another example where we have mid-block crosswalks and some of the additional treatments. This tool can't be used without further investigation to determine where new types of new crosswalks should be sited, but it can certainly indicate that we may need some at new locations. But if you already have crosswalks present, then these are some of the treatments that can further enhance those crossings. So then finally, as I mentioned before, we can use the predictions, and these numbers in the middle column here are just showing the average SPF predicted crashes for all 50 of these sites, but there's a range of values here. So if we don't have enough money to treat all of those 50 sites, then we can maybe start dropping the sites with the lowest predictions and treat those with a higher expectation until we have used up our pot of money. So that's part of what is done in this next part of the process is to investigate the sites that you've ranked and that may be part of this treatment package. Any needed community engagement. Some kinds of measures may be controversial, or if you don't already have community buy-in, for example, for road diets to be extensively implemented, there may need to be some more work to do there. And to make sure that the community is on board with the kinds of treatments that you're planning to put in, that they're comprehended, and they fit with the community and their lived experience and their needs. So it's a time to get more input really about what is needed to make things safer for all the people who live and work and travel in an area. So that's part of the diagnosis process is the engineering diagnosis as well, and that may involve procedures like road safety audits. And then in this process, I talked about the fact that you can bundle like sites for potential treatment and the cost effectiveness analysis, and then allocate funding and construct those treatments. And always evaluation is an important part of this process and can help us get better. So hopefully this research helped us see a new way of using data, not just to identify high crash sites that may warrant treatment, but to be more proactive about addressing the risks that we may see across the network and get beyond kind of a nominal safety approach to a more real and proactive safety approach. These metrics can be used to identify and rank locations that consider a more comprehensive set of risks, such that kind of incorporate, where and when and how people live and use their environment. We know pedestrians can cross a road anywhere, and often do, regardless of whether there's a nearby intersection with a signal and a crosswalk. We have to think about how pedestrians travel, their economy of movement. They may be tired after a long day of work. So these kinds of data can help us get better. I'm not saying they're fully accounting for these kinds of issues, but they can help us get better at identifying the kinds of locations that may warrant treatment. It is data intensive and skill intensive, but it's not that hard. Cities that have done it have said it's well worth it. And once you start to build these kinds of data, you can just keep improving those data. And then they become a basis also for future evaluations and just doing a better job of using the kinds of resources that Taha has set up for people to select the right types of treatments, because then they have the information they need to know about those locations. Which of these CMFs is appropriate for these kinds of locations we have. There's some of the references mentioned. I won't linger on that, but just in case you want to look at these slides later. And I just wanted to give a shout out. I don't know if others at the university are attending, but we're building definitely on the shoulders of others. I mentioned some specifically along the way, but in addition, we were very honored and touched to receive the Patricia F. Waller Award this past year at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting for our paper based on this research. And Pat Waller was hired by B.J. Campbell as one of the first part of the group to work at HSRC. And Bill, you can correct me, I think she was there for about 20 years. And then she was the founding director of the Injury Prevention Research Center here at UNC, that she became very interested in motor vehicle related injury research, and then later went on to be the director of the Michigan Transportation Research Center. So we're very honored to receive the award named in her honor. You can see the photo there of her receiving the Roy Crum Award at TRB in 1995. And others of our directors, Forest Council and B.J. Campbell, have also received the Roy Crum Distinguished Service Award from TRB. So again, I just wanted to give a shout out to all the work that has gone before that helps us push forward and try to garner more understanding. I was pleased to learn that Pat Waller really was a humanist and took a very human-centered approach to her work, and sort of blew a lot of ideas out of the water about, for example, driver training and how it's a complex skill that we have very limited understanding of how people, young people learn to drive and the requirements for that. And so her work and ideas helped lead to the graduated driver licensing system, which has led to the many reductions in young driver crashes and fatalities. That's it. Any questions? And I'm sure Taha is ready and happy to take questions as well. And I took too much time, as usual.
So I'm just looking at the chat box, and I just have one question that was sent to me, and that is asking, what is TISMO? So when I was showing the search page of the CMF Clearinghouse, one of the frequent search terms are known as TISMO, TSMO. Just to clarify, TISMO stands for Transportation Systems Management and Operations, and it's a set of strategies that are used to improve the transportation system operational capacity. Yeah.
Great.
Apart from that, I don't see any other questions in the chat box. If anybody has specific questions, they can come out of mute and share your questions with us. I think we still have about 4 minutes remaining for this webinar.
And we'll be happy for you to follow up and send us an email as well.
Yep.
I know a lot of you are with HSRC, and so
Libby,
yes.
have you heard anything from Seattle in terms of how they're using the results from this research, and if they're getting to that evaluation step of how well whatever they're implementing is working?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did try to work with them. We provided some screening and ranking and some ideas of sites they might investigate, but then they became very busy with some other crises and we haven't had a chance to follow up with them and, about that. But we know we had earlier done another project with them where we analyzed intersection crashes. And we know from that project, they did investigate some of the highly ranked intersections, and they found and were able to verify that there were conflicts at signalized locations. And so they have prioritized both higher crash locations and highly ranked locations from the SPF predictions for treatment. And so they were able to use the data and these prediction metrics in cost benefit analyses, and the state allowed them to seek funding through their highway safety improvement program to implement leading pedestrian intervals to reduce conflicts at many of these locations. And at some locations, I know they also use the data to help get actual turn restrictions in place. So they use the data from our study to help supplement motor vehicle crash data they had to justify turning restrictions. So I know they're on board and would like to do it more. They're also taking many other actions right now relating to speed management and reducing speed limits and increasing signing of these new lower posted limits on their streets. So they're very, very busy, but doing a lot of great things. But I don't know specifically if they've had a chance to follow up on these data. In addition, since this time, we analyzed the new data for them, and so they're probably busily working with the new analysis results we generated for them.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, okay. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Sorry we didn't get to chat or interact more. But thank you for joining.
Well done.
Thank you for joining
Good
this presentation, guys.
presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.